Hello, welcome to the Wildline Podcast. I'm your host, Dan. This is a podcast about movies and how much money they make at the box office. Today is going to be a little bit of a special. We're going to talk about Marvel Infinity War. The culmination of 10 years of the Marvel Cinematic Universe is getting released tomorrow in previews. The full release, of course, is on Friday. And I wanted to do, just because it's the 10-year anniversary of MCU, this film is massive. It does have a chance to break the all-time opening weekend record set by The Force Awakens. So I figured it would be a good opportunity to do a preview show. So what I'm going to do for this show is pretty simple. We'll walk through first what people are saying, what Variety's saying, what Deadline's saying, what the industry is saying about this film and how well it's going to do. Walk briefly through the history of MCU, trying to put this in context, where that brand has started and where it has gone over the last 10 years. And finally, we'll probably talk a little bit about the comic book movie genre in general. It is something that I talk about all the time on this podcast. I love talking about it. So I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into the overall genre and see how Avengers Infinity War is going to fit into that narrative over the last 15, 20 years of comic book movies. But I didn't want to do that first. I want to dive right into the numbers and talk about, what the range is here for Avengers Infinity War. So, of course, Avengers Infinity War, this is part one, and the reviews that have come out have basically said that, yes, indeed, it kind of, it doesn't exactly have a really tight ending, if you will. So I think it's going to continue on into next year's film, which comes out, I believe, April, May 2019, part two of this movie series. So it is a little bit strange. It's a strange beast as a two-parter. Kind of maybe we'll play like the Harry Potter series, like the last two movies that were split up. And I think was Hunger Games split up into two movies too. I think it was the final chapter. And of course, like in those cases, especially with Hunger Games, they wanted to get as much money out of those properties as possible. With this one, it doesn't really seem that way because it's not based on a specific book like Harry Potter and Hunger Games. What did I call it before? Hunger Wars, whatever that is. So they weren't really limited by that. So they can kind of go do whatever they want with the story. So it might play like those two split series, and it might be play completely differently. Right now, Avengers Infinity War has an 86 rating on Rotten Tomatoes. That's with 144 reviews. That's a pretty significant amount of reviews. It's still early. It was at 90 before, dropped a little bit. The average rating is 7.7. Which is pretty good. I think this is kind of falling in where the expectations were in terms of the critical consensus of this film. This was not expected to be the next Godfather, although some of the MCU fanboys and sort of true believers believe it will be. It's not really seen that way by critics, and so it's going to get knocked a little bit just because it's 2.5, two really long movie. You kind of have to be engaged in the MCU brand to really fully experience it. So an 86 score for a movie like this is really fantastic. And it just goes to show you that the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the Marvel brand, and Disney know exactly what they're doing when they create these films. They're creating engaging, really entertaining movies that I think a lot of people have loved, and I think a lot of people are going to love Avengers Infinity War. In terms of the quality looks like it's there. It's your typical tier A top shelf MCU film, bombastic, richly engaging, over the top, probably some comedy involved, like a very good popcorn movie at the end of the day. And so there's not going to be a Batman versus Superman scenario here. There's not going to be a Justice League scenario here. And I'm not trying to rip on DC or anything like that, but like those movies were in similar situations where there was this absolute mountain of hype before they came out. And I mean massive, especially Batman versus Superman. And the moment the reviews started to pop in and come in, people sort of got like a little bit of a knot in their stomach. Is like, is this really going to be good? And then when people saw those films, they weren't good. And I don't think there's anybody who can really argue objectively that Batman vs. Superman and Justice League are good films on any way, like not just artistically, but even from a popcorn blockbuster entertainment perspective, they weren't that good. And so MCU has sort of avoided those pitfalls that DC has unfortunately fallen into with producing movies like this. And at least like Avengers Infinity War is going to be obviously another big massive hit. But it's important to note that Rotten Tomato score from critics, because that will play into its box office performance, absolutely, especially on the back end in terms of its legs. So, where are we starting out with this thing? Tracking, tracking starts 3 weeks, industry tracking, official tracking, not just people guessing. Industry tracking starts about 3 weeks before a movie comes out. And that tracking for Avengers Infinity War was 170 to about 210. A big range. That's usually how it happens. And then as they continue to survey people closer to the actual release date, that tracking number gets a little bit more specific and moves a lot. I think the tracking, I can't remember what the tracking was initially for Black Panther, but it started out in like the 120s, 130s and got up to 170 right before it got released. And of course, it actually did 202. So tracking is not perfect. But more than anything, tracking can tell you the hype level for a film. Because if a movie starts out at 170 and the tracking keeps moving up and up and up as the days get closer to the release, then you know that there's a buzz and like a wave of hype that is coming for a film. And that is exactly what's happened to Avengers Infinity War. 3 weeks ago, the range was in the high 100s, and it just kept moving a little bit further north and north and north. And there's a few different perspectives here through a few different ranges that people are throwing out there. There is technically a specific industry range that they use, but I think different publications like Variety, Hollywood Reporter, and I'll talk about these in a second, and Deadline maybe use a little bit more of their own math to figure out their own specific range and prediction for the film. But let's walk through them really quickly. Variety is saying 225, and this is of course domestically. Domestic is the United States and Canada. This is for the opening weekend of Avengers Infinity War. Variety is saying 225 to 245, with the possibility of it even crossing the 250 million mark, which of course would be the ultimate all-time record for opening weekend at the domestic box office. The current record holder, I should say, is Star Wars The Force Awakens, of course, which came out December 2015. That opened at $247.97 million. So tracking is already suggesting right now, and again, tracking is not perfect, but it gives us a ballpark. The industry is thinking Avengers Infinity War is going to blast past the original Avengers film, which opened at 207, which is number 3 all time at the box office. Of course, Last Jedi. Oh, I'm sorry. I totally forgot about Jurassic World. So Marvel Avengers is number 4 all time. Black Panther is number 5 all time, which still doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, what an insane performance. So tracking right now has Avengers pretty easily beating Star Wars The Last Jedi at 220. With the possibility, if it really breaks out from this tracking, which is totally possible because Black Panther came in at 170 tracking, opened up at 202, right? Like over $30 million off in terms of the ceiling of the tracking. That wasn't even the low end of the tracking. So there's a possibility here that Avengers Infinity War will come in on Monday as the biggest wide release opening weekend of all time, which would be really cool to see. I feel like we've just been breaking records left and right at least recently. So that's what Variety is saying. Box Office Pro, I have mixed feelings about Box Office Pro. Here's why. They do a long-range forecast before anybody else. It's usually, I want to say it's like 2 months out. They look at films that are 2 months from release, and they give us a guess. And I appreciate that because as someone who plays games like Hollywood Stock Exchange, it gives me a good idea of what to invest in, at least what people inside the industry are thinking about a film. The problem, though, is that when you're guessing that far out, it's really hard to even get a ballpark prediction for a film. It's nearly impossible. You have to do some actual surveying and get some customer data. What's the awareness for the film? What's the desire to see this film from actual people? Box Office Pro doesn't do that. I think they look at a lot of social media metrics, which is okay, but like it's not the same thing as an actual survey. So they tend to be like way off with their long range projections. But as they get closer to the movie opening, they tend to be a lot better. They're saying 235, 255. So they're about 10 million higher than Variety. And we'll just leave it at that. They're 10 million higher than Variety. Hollywood Reporter is coming in at 225. They're basically saying we know that it's going to open. We think we know that it's going to open at about 225 and higher. They don't really suggest a ceiling to their prediction. They're thinking, and they note here, it could beat The Force Awakens at 248, technically 247. So they're kind of right in line with what Variety is saying. Deadline is interesting. Deadline is predicting a significantly lower opening for Avengers Infinity War, and I'm wondering where they're getting their data and information from. I wonder if they're using the same survey data that Variety and Hollywood Reporter gets and Box Office Pro. It's saying, we're actually reading the numbers, the tea leaves a little bit differently. They're saying 216 to 235 for Avengers Infinity War. So that's what the industry is saying. And one thing to note, too, that's really going to affect this opening is that I believe it's going to be the second biggest wide release ever in terms of theaters. The theater count is 4,470. I think Despicable Me 3 is the only thing that's ever been north of that. And that is significant for one main reason, right? If you can get the per theater average decently high, even with the all-time range, sort of the all-time records here, the all-time record for a per theater average was $59,000, almost $60,000 per theater, and that was Force Awakens. But it opened on 300 less theaters, actually more than almost 350 less theaters. So Avengers Infinity War, it's clear that this is a play, right? Marvel and Disney are basically saying, we want the record. We want to go for the 248 record, even though they're the same company now. Disney does own Marvel and does own LucasArts, I want to say. Is that the video game company? They do own the Star Wars franchise, so they'd just be beating themselves for the record. But it seems pretty clear that Marvel wants that record, and that's what they're going for. There's no other reason to open it on that many screens. It's an outrageous number of screens. Sure, it's been a little quiet at the box office recently. A Quiet Place was the big winner in April. But besides that, it's been kind of sleepy at the box office for April, and it's going to be such a weird April and May. I mean, I don't know what is going on with the scheduling, but it's wide open for Avengers, and so they're going to take every theater and every screen and every showing they can get. And I'm hearing stories of like in New York and Los Angeles of like 3 a.m. screenings, like just like there was for Force Awakens. So it does seem like there is a real potential here for Avengers Infinity War to break the all-time record. I think this is a good point to sort of take a step back and think about this a little bit more. Like Avengers Infinity War is the technically third Avengers film. The original Avengers opened up in May 2012 to $207 million. I was taking a break from the box office sort of nerddom back then, and I wasn't really following it closely. But when that happened, I was really busy with work in my career. And when that happened at 207, I was just like, I just got me re-engaged. It's like, what? $207 million? Like, it's hard to illustrate to other people who have not been following the box office that $200 million mark at the opening weekend. The moment Avengers passed that, it was just like all bets were off for the future. Like all records are on the table now. Like it's just like, it was amazing. So it was a milestone, not only for the comic book movie genre and MCU, but just for the box office in general. It was the all-time record. It stayed there for a while, but it was just that $200 million mark was just amazing to see happen. And then it went on to have fantastic legs. It's one thing if you open a movie massively huge. A good example is Black Panther. Way over-indexed what it was supposed to open at. But the real magic is when it has great legs and it does like over a 3x multiplier. And that's what the original Avengers did. Opened at 207, ended at 623. Just fantastic, just amazing. And really not expected back then. It wasn't expected. It was expected to be a massive film, it'd be huge, but not at that level. These were entirely new levels. And then, of course, Avengers Age of Ultron came out in May 2015. Did 191 open. That was a little bit, after the 207, 3 years later, the thought was that the sequel's going to do even bigger, right? It didn't. And it wasn't a big disappointment. It just wasn't, people weren't like super stoked and like amazed by it like the original Avengers. It ended up at 459 total at the box office. And that number was low compared to the original Avengers, right? Like, it's not anywhere near 623. I think the big issue there was that the multiplier was so low. The multiplier wasn't anywhere near 3. It was 2.4, which is really bad. And so I think the reaction to that film was a little bit muted. You ask people now about Age of Ultron, and they're sort of like, it was good. MCU fans love anything in the series, and I'm not going to, sort of disparage any part of the cinematic universe that Marvel has built. But a lot of sort of impartial people were sort of like, yeah, Age of Ultron's not that great. I've seen it. I've seen the Avengers. Ultron's not fantastic. And I'm not the biggest comic book movie nerd, but it had some problems. And you could see that in the multiplier. People did not go back and see it over and over again. So it did 459. So this is the continuation of that series. We are now, God, that was only 3 years ago. That feels like 20 years ago when Ultron came out. So we're 3 years later. It is April 2018. The expectation now, based on tracking, is that Infinity War is going to destroy these films, right? It's going to blast through what the original Avengers did, and really improve on what Age of Ultron did. And I think there's a lot of stuff going on here. There's a lot more characters. The cinematic universe has been built out a ton more since then. Think of all the characters that have been added since then, especially in the last few years. Like Ant-Man and Black Panther, they're all going to be involved. And then, of course, Guardians of the Galaxy, they're going to be sort of plugged into this. It's going to be pretty amazing. Like, I don't know how they did this film, or the production of it must have been a nightmare to get all these stars into the same movie, and all these different sort of series within the cinematic universe to sort of cross over. But it's gonna blow away what the original Avengers had done, the first two movies. And then it's kind of cool too if you look back on where the Marvel Cinematic Universe has been over the last decade. It's insane. It's honestly insane. I remember going to see Iron Man opening weekend. What was it? May 2008. My friend who was a big comic book movie guy was like, dude, you got to come see this. This is going to be awesome. I was sort of like, whatever. I'll go see it. I love going to see movies. And I sat there. I was like, wow. Like, it wasn't like a normal comic book movie. The quality was much higher, and it was much more entertaining than the other comic book movies that have been out. There was a polish to it, not just necessarily on the writing, but more on the construction and the editing and the pacing of it. It was just a very well done film and a great way to kick off MCU. And what's interesting about that, and I'll talk a little about this more later, is the comic book movie genre in general. That was also the same year that Dark Knight came out, right? So it was like you had this huge peak of the comic book movie genre in Dark Knight, but at the same time you had this beginning happen at the same time for a whole new wave of comic book movies. And then after that, they stumbled a little bit with Incredible Hulk. Iron Man 2 came out in May 2010, opened at 128, closed out at 312. These are not adjusted for inflation, by the way. But that one pretty much copied what the original Iron Man did. I don't know what the critical consensus among the fans is for Iron Man 2. Someone posted on Reddit, if you really want to know what people think, go into Reddit, our movies, and somebody posted a thread on what's the worst MCU film. Really interesting read what people had to say. Answers were all over the place, but a lot of them pointed to Thor Dark World, which came out in November 2013, but we'll get to that. But Iron Man 2 came up a little bit as well. So did Iron Man 3, which I think was Shane Black, which doesn't really make a lot of sense. I thought it was pretty cool. Okay, so Iron Man 2, May 2010, starting to build out the universe, added another character, Thor. Incredible Hulk never came back, really. I mean, he did, but like not as his own movie and his own character. Most recently, he was in Thor Ragnarok, played a really good part of that. So Thor started, that was May 2011, opened at 65, kind of low, but did really well, sort of multiple. Not a 3x multiple, but close. 181 for its total gross domestically. And then you had a launch of another character, Captain America, the First Avenger. That was July 2011, same year. Opened at 65, almost identical to what Thor opened at. And ended up a little bit below that, 176. Then was the big movie. You know, a year later, Avengers, the original, opened at 207, closed it at 623. Changed the ball game for all movies, and the entire box office was sort of upended with that film. Then Iron Man 3 came out a year later. Opened at 174, closed that at 409. That's a really interesting jump now that I'm looking at it, the numbers now. It's like before Avengers came out, none of these movies hit 400, and now Iron Man 3 all of a sudden bumps up to 409 in 2013. You got to think that the Avengers' success had a lot to do with that. Thor: Dark World, which is, you know, widely considered as one of the worst MCU films, opened at 85, closed out at 206. So it didn't even get anywhere close to the 3x multiplier, which indicates bad quality, right? Then Captain America: The Winter Soldier came out in April 2014, opened at 95 million, closed at 259. People love that movie, and they look back on it really fondly. God, I don't remember that coming out. I don't think I've ever seen that movie. Things really switched up with Guardians of the Galaxy. It came out in August 2014. Opened to a really surprising $94 million. It was surprising because it seemed that Guardians of the Galaxy was a really unknown kind of side part of the Marvel universe. You know, everybody knows Thor, everybody knows Iron Man, everybody knows Captain America. So those are sort of like the easy home runs that they could hit. Guardians of the Galaxy seemed like a little bit more of a bet. But I think it's one of the best MCU films by far. I mean, it's amazing. It's a really fun movie. Opened up at 94, had a fantastic multiplier, which of course indicates what? High quality, great word of mouth. Closed out at $333 million. We talked about Age of Ultron. That opened up in May 2015, 191 opening weekend, closed out at 459. Not a great multiplier. I think you know what that means. Ant-Man. This is when I got into a lot of fights about Ant-Man back in 2015. I didn't really get what they were going for here. I knew that they were trying to expand the universe and add more characters. It just seemed like Ant-Man did not have the cachet or the hook or hype to it to really launch a whole nother line of movies. And I didn't necessarily get proven wrong, but let me put it to you this way. Like, Ant-Man did not, you know, sort of it has been the lowest performing MCU film of the last 7 years almost. You'd have to go back to 2011 to get a film that didn't hit $180 million at the box office. Most of them blow past 200. So Ant-Man opened up at 57, the lowest opening of an MCU film since The Incredible Hulk. And that was 8 years earlier, or 7 years earlier, I should say. Closed out at 180. So it had a fantastic multiplier, though. The thing is, like, it had a cinema score of A from what I remember. People really enjoyed it. It was a very different type of MCU movie. It just had a different vibe. It was a lot looser, a lot more comedic. And people, when you talk about Ant-Man now, they're like, oh yeah, I love that movie. Anybody I know who's in the MCU is like, they love Ant-Man. It was just kind of like a weird sort of lull in the MCU universe. And we'll see how the sequel does. I'm not sure how it's going to do this year. I think it's Ant-Man and the Wasp. And then Captain America Civil War, of course, comes out in May of 2016. Opens up at 179. Fantastic opening for that. That was one of the rare cases where a movie was super hyped, felt like the hype was growing towards release. Tracking was putting it in the high 100s and the low 200s, and it just didn't hit that. It doesn't matter, though. Opened at 179, closed out at 408. Again, multiplier there, not fantastic. I don't know why. I thought people really liked Civil War. I'm not really sure why that. It was also kind of seen as Avengers 3, too. At least the marketing was sort of posited that was what the movie was all about. There's going to be all these characters in it, Spider-Man, stuff like that. But a great performance, 408 total. Another side character gets introduced, Doctor Strange, in November of 2016. Opens at 85, closes out at 232. Kind of your typical origin story movie for MCU. Opens in the 80s, closes out in the low 200s, right? I think Guardians 2 came out last year, last year, May 2017. That did 146 opening weekend, closed it at 389. Some quality complaints on that one, but for the most part, people really love that movie. It's really fun. Spider-Man Homecoming, sort of the reboot and really bringing in Spider-Man officially into the MCU. Still produced by Sony though, but it's technically part of MCU. I don't know how that works. I'm not going to dive into it. Opened at 117, which felt pretty low back then when it happened. But it did close out at 334. Great multiplier for that movie. Just played super strong from July all the way through the end of last summer. And then Thor Ragnarok this last fall, November 2017, opened up 122, closed out at 315. And at this point, it seemed like you could kind of predict what an MCU film was going to do based on whether it was an Avengers film, a reboot, or, the second Thor movie. You can kind of guess what it was going to do. So when Black Panther came along, I think I myself included felt like, oh, it's going to open like a Doctor Strange, 85. It's going to open like maybe a Captain America or a Thor movie. Things have changed a little bit, so maybe it opens in the low 100s. That was the thought process, and I'm not sort of downplaying that at all. That's what people were thinking 6 months before Black Panther was going to open. But the hype just built and built and built and built and built. And it ends up being the second best performing MCU film of all time in terms of its opening weekend. It actually goes on to beat Avengers later. It's still in the movie theaters, folks. Like, Black Panther has not gone away. I don't think it hits home video until probably mid-May. So Black Panther, of course, opened this last February. Opened at 202, closed out at 682. So that's the MCU world. That's a quick review of what happens. There's clearly like different tiers within the MCU, right? You have the origin first movies for a lot of these characters like Iron Man, Doctor Strange, Thor, Ant-Man. They usually open below 100. Guardians of the Galaxy is another example. Opens below 100. The Spider-Man reboot, it felt like it was the sixth Spider-Man movie in the last like 15 years. You thought it would open at like 150, but opened at 117. So there's that tier of films where the sort of the $100 million openers, we'll call that, and they go on to do about 3x, $300 million. Then you have the tier 2, or so the tier 1, we'll call those tier 2. Tier 1 MCU are the Avengers films, the later movies in a series. Captain America Civil War is the third Captain America movie. Iron Man 3 is the third Iron Man movie, both open in the 170s. And of course, the Avengers films opening in the high 100s or low 200s. The only outlier here, of course, is going to be Black Panther, which was an origin film that opened at 202. So absolutely nuts and crazy that it did that. So if we're trying to put into context, where's Avengers Infinity War? It's clearly a tier 1 MCU film. At 6 months ago, people were thinking this is going to open around $200 million. So it hasn't really deviated that much from that prediction. It's only really gone up. Now we're talking about, I think, when tracking was starting 3 weeks ago, we were thinking, like high 100s probably. It's gonna hit at least. But I think everybody sort of realized, yeah, it's definitely going to break 200. The question was like, is it going to beat Avengers? Probably. Is it going to beat like Jurassic World? Maybe. And it's been crazy to see it just go up and up and up. And you think about MCU and you're like, wow, it's been 10 years and it just seems like they're always getting better and their big movies are always making more money. And it wasn't like that things weren't going well when we got into Black Panther. Things were going great when we got to Black Panther, and then it was just bumped up to a whole new, ridiculous, unimaginable level. And I think Avengers Infinity War feels like we're going to just bump it up again, like we're going to break the all-time record for opening weekend. It is a possibility that's going to happen. There's also another possibility, and MCU fans may want to won't listen to me when I start talking about this, but I'm a realist, I'm a skeptic, and I'm a cynic. And the deadline numbers suggest to me Deadline's a little bit more vicious when it comes to their predictions. What I mean by that is like, look, they obviously have industry contacts. They need that industry pipeline of information. They're not going to like badmouth a lot of people in the industry, but they're also sort of a rag. And I don't know, I think they're a little bit more open and honest when it comes to stuff, and they're putting in at 216, 235. My guess right now, if I didn't know the theater counts, I would say I don't think it's going to play Force Awakens. I just don't see it. The hype doesn't seem like it's that level. Force Awakens was like the biggest movie in 30 years. I mean, it's so hard to put into context how big that movie was just with everybody. I felt like 6 months before Star Wars came out, everybody was talking about it. And now that they're not talking about Avengers Infinity War, but it's like comic book movie fans are talking about it. My mom's not talking about it. My mom was talking about Star Wars 6 months before it came out. So it doesn't seem like, to me, it's going to break out of a core group of people. That core group of people is millions of people who want to see this movie. There's tons of people. I have no doubt it's going to blast through 200 opening weekend. And blast through, I think Avengers is going to be smoke. I think it's going to do over 2.7. Obviously, Black Panther would be smoke then too at 202. My guess for it was 220s before I knew the theater count. But when the theater count comes into play, it changes the ball game a bit. Just because it's not opening on 4,000 screens like Black Panther did. It's opening on 4,470 screens. It's going to be the second biggest wide release ever in terms of theater count. So it is clear that they want Avengers Infinity War to try and break as many records as possible. And let's just take a quick look at the numbers a little bit, just to sort of get a better idea of what it's going to have to do to break the all-time record. So at 4,470 theaters, if it has the same per theater average as Force Awakens, which I don't even think is doable, it would open at $268 million. So it would blow past the Force Awakens by $20 million. I will bet my life that will not happen. It will not break 200. It will not hit $268 million. And I'm not even saying that just because I don't think the hype's there. I'm saying that because logistically, it feels like that would be really hard to do. Force Awakens, to me, I predicted Force Awakens within about $2 million its opening weekend. It's one of my proudest moments in box office nerdery. And the reason I did that, and I basically said to myself, it's like, what is the theoretical limit here to what a movie can do over a 3-day and 1 night period, right? And The Force Awakens, to me, felt like it got pretty close. You're going to have some loss in terms of just, you're not going to fill every seat for every show, but you're going to get pretty darn close with a movie like Force Awakens, even if the showing's at 2 a.m. It was just one of those once-in-a-generation openings. Avengers Infinity War does not feel like a once-in-a-generation opening. It just does not to me. I would say, though, that a really good ballpark for this in terms of getting really specific about how well Avengers Infinity War is going to do is let's plug in Black Panther's per theater average, right? Because Black Panther was like super, super hyped. Not as hyped as Force Awakens, not even as hyped as Last Jedi. Had a little bit lower per theater average, but it was really rocking back in February, a couple months ago. People were all over that movie. I feel like Infinity War feels pretty similar in terms of the level of hype and the willingness to go see it. So let's plug that in. So $50,250, times our theater count here. And of course I lost it. And let's see where it got. 4470 gets me $224 million. That feels so right to me. Like 225 just feels what this movie is going to do. It does not seem to me like this is a record breaker. It just doesn't, in terms of the overall record. It's going to break some records, don't get me wrong. It just does not have that hype among casuals that a movie like Force Awakens did. Black Panther just seems like it's right in line with that. And, there's even an argument that you can make, and I made this argument like right after Black Panther opened, that maybe Black Panther is going to take some business away from Infinity War. And that sounds ridiculous and stupid maybe, but think of it this way. It's just basic economics. People have limited funds, right? They're only going to see 4 to 5 movies a year on average. If they went out to go see Black Panther, and a lot of people did, does that mean they're going to go out 2 months later to see Infinity War as well? And I'm talking about the person who goes 4 times a year, which is the average person. My guess would be like, they might not. They might wait for it till it hits VOD. That's just one argument that I have in my head. I don't know if I believe that argument, because the hype for Infinity War, if you look at the pre-sales, you look at the social media, that's one thing Box Office Pro does do well. They look at the social media very closely. And they're saying the film, Infinity War's Twitter footprint is now more than double of Age of Ultron and remains ahead of Star Wars Last Jedi. Age of Ultron doesn't matter to me because it's like 3 years in social media world. It's like 30 years. But the fact that it's above Last Jedi right now in terms of its Twitter footprint is a big deal. And I think that, and people, the Box Office Pro also talks about the finale factor. This is sort of the end of the current MCU world, and we're going to go into a whole different series of movies and characters now. It is the end of this first stage of MCU. So there's that thing going for it. I just don't, with the theater count as high as it is, there's going to be plenty of opportunity to see this movie at any time you want to go see it. There's going to be 2 a.m. showings, 3 a.m. showings, it sounds like, but I just don't think the casual hype is there to get it to break the record. Now, let's see what it would need to break that record. So let's say $248 million opening weekend. Let's see what its per theater average would be to break the record. It would need to be $55,000, almost $55,500 per theater. That would put it north of a lot of movies. That would be north of The Last Jedi. That would be north of Jurassic World significantly, north of the Avengers by a lot, north of Black Panther by a lot. I don't see that. I don't see that happening. I could be completely wrong, but my gut and my head are saying I don't think it's going to get there. I think it probably will beat Star Wars The Last Jedi just because of the theater count. But I don't see its per theater average going up to $55,000 per theater. I don't think it's going to happen. That's my take on it. Obviously, the industry is saying 225 to 245. Box Office Pro is saying maybe up to 255 to break the record. Hollywood Reporters also says it has a chance to break the record, but Deadline is more in line with what I'm saying. I'm saying like mid 220s for Avengers Infinity War. That's sort of my official guess. I'll leave it at that. So, where does that, we talked about it in terms of like MCU, what it means. Obviously, MCU is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And it has been an amazing, I think it's the most significant story in the box office in my lifetime. I've been around since the early 80s. I'm 35 years old. MCU is the biggest story of all that. It has been one of the most fascinating stories to follow. I didn't pay a lot of attention to it in the late 2000s, 2008, 2009. I was like, okay, they're going to try this thing and see what happens. But when Avengers did what it did, and they just kept pumping out these huge popcorn masterpieces of just entertainment, it became a sight to behold. And they just have not stopped hitting home runs. And then they hit a grand slam with Avengers. And they hit a grand slam recently with the Black Panther, which is just, I still can't wrap my head around the Black Panther, how well it did. It's just so cool and awesome. And Avengers Infinity War, I think, is going to be the cherry on top for them. That's what it really feels like to me. And so with the MCU, the question is, where is MCU going to go now? And where is the comic book movie going to go after Avengers Infinity War? What is next for the comic book movie genre is really what I'm asking here. And if we take a quick look back at just very briefly, a brief history overview of the comic book genre, I'll try and do it in like 10 minutes, maybe 5 minutes. We'll see how quickly I can do it. But we're in the renaissance of the comic book movie genre, right? It started around the first X-Men came out. But before that, there were comic book movies. There was Superman, there was Batman, Dick Tracy, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, even side movies like The Crow, Men in Black. They all did really well. The highlights before the first X-Men came out in 2000, which is, I think, the start of the current comic book movie renaissance, I'll call it. Batman adjusted made $564 million. Men in Black in 1997. The Batman movie was 1989, by the way. Men in Black in 1997 did $489 million. really massive movies. Men in Black didn't really feel like a comic book movie. It felt like a sci-fi movie, but it was based on a comic book series. And then X-Men in 2000, some people may not see that as the real start of this renaissance because it only did 261 adjusted domestically here. But it felt like when X-Men came out that the genre shift. It was the first big comic book movie in 2 years. It came out in July 2000. It did so well. It was so exciting, so well done. And then the big one hit after that. 2 years later, Spider-Man comes out. A movie that was probably in development for 30 years, it feels like. May 3rd, 2002, it hits. It does $623 million adjusted, 403 actual. But 623 in today's dollars, unbelievable, mind-blowing that it did that much. I mean, that was really the start of this first wave of the comic book movie renaissance. And then we had a lot of hits after that. Men in Black 2 came out, 293 adjusted. The X2 came out, did fantastic, 319. And this is where the ball really starts to get rolling. Like every year we're getting a big comic book movie, when before it was like 3 or 4 years before anything significant would come out in the 80s and 90s. Then you have Spider-Man 2 drop in 2004. That's really, the Spider-Man movie series was really the peak of that first wave of comic book movies. That did, Spider-Man 2 came out in June 2004. I remember seeing it opening weekend. I was living in Minneapolis. I did $539 million total, adjusted. Just like amazing, the money printing machines at this point. There's a little bit like, Constantine, Sin City come out after that, do okay, and it ended like 100 million. Batman Begins, the Batman series, is rebooted in 2005 by Christopher Nolan. That does 287. And then we have a couple $200 million films, Fantastic Four, Superman Returns, the new X-Men did 3, X-Men The Last, what was that one called? I don't remember. 2006 one? Oh, X-Men Last Stand, yep. May 2006, that did 320 million. Superman Returns comes out in 2006 as well, does 274 million. So these movies are easily hitting 200 million bucks. And the industry sees that and they start pumping them out. Batman Begins does not happen unless Spider-Man happens before that and does so well. And so they start greenlighting a lot of these comic book movies. That's really the glut of the first wave, and it continues to do that. You have stuff like 300, which technically counts as a comic movie. Spider-Man 3 does really well at $438 million total. But quality-wise, Spider-Man 3, people hate that movie. Like, ask anybody about Spider-Man 3, they're like, oh, it's awful. But the movies just keep coming. Iron Man comes out, does 398, kind of the start, maybe of another wave. But the real start of the second wave of comic book movies is The Dark Knight, the second movie in the Christopher Nolan series reboot of Batman. Dark Knight comes out in July 2008. I remember driving back from Chicago. I don't know why I was in Chicago. I think it was at Pitchfork Music Festival back then. And even the late night radio show hosts were talking about how well Dark Knight did at the box office that weekend. Closed out at 666, beating Spider-Man. Biggest comic book movie of all time ever up until that point. That's the start of the second wave. Then you get stuff like Watchmen, didn't do too well, 128, kind of a failed opportunity there. Iron Man 2 comes out, does 355. Thor does 204 adjusted. X-Men First Class. That's when X-Men started to fade pretty significantly. It was 2011's First Class. Was not very good. I saw it opening weekend. It was not good. Closed it at 165. Not a good return. Not even close to Last Stand, which closed out at 320. Like a really poor performance overall in that movie. There were some misses. Like Green Lantern did 131. Then the MCU starts to kick in. 199 for Captain America. And then, of course, Avengers in 2012 does 702 adjusted. And I consider that the start of the third wave of this comic movie renaissance. The first wave, sort of the proto of this thing, is X-Men movie. Then Spider-Man really starts the first wave. Then Dark Knight kicks in the second wave in 2008. 4 years later, you get the third wave with Avengers. That's really the sort of peak of MCU at that time. And then you just have some huge movies afterwards. The Spider-Man gets rebooted because the third Spider-Man was terrible. The Amazing Spider-Man comes out from Sony. 295. You can't scoff at that, but it's not nowhere near the originals. Dark Knight Rises, the sequel to Dark Knight, 4 years later, comes out at 505 total. Iron Man 3 does fantastic at 451. What else? Man of Steel does 321. So again, just consistently hitting 300, 400, sometimes $500 million domestically. The industry is pouring money into comic book movies at this point. They're literally trying to greenlight any single comic book movie series they can. And then you get some like the minor sort of not great hits, like the Wolverine does 146. Thor Dark World does 227. Captain America Winter Soldier does 285. Amazing Spider-Man 2 does 222, and you can tell that series sort of ended pretty much at that moment, unfortunately. I forget who the director was. That the same director as 500 Days of Summer, I think? Mark Webb? I can't remember. But that was I never saw any of those movies, but you listen to comic movie fans, and they're like, the Amazing Spider-Man movies are like an anathema. Like, they just don't even want to talk about them. That's how bad they view those films. Guardians comes out a little bit after that. The new X-Men movie, Days of Future Past, is 256. Not bad. Improvement on First Class. Guardians of the Galaxy does 365. Again, we're just like cruising. Things are just cruising. Even Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles gets rebooted, does 209. Age of Ultron in 2015, now we're only 3 years ago, does 488. A good performance, but nowhere near the 702 of the original, which was only 3 years earlier. Then you have some minor movies we talked about, like Ant-Man, and then I really think, and not necessarily financially, but I think creatively, the genre hits its fourth wave with Deadpool in February 2016, only 2 years ago. Feels like a long time ago, though. The reason I say that is this. Ultron came out in May 2015. You did not have a major comic book movie do well. Ant-Man did okay. The F4 final Fantastic Four reboot, I think it was August, was a complete disaster. So you had nothing come out for almost a year in the comic book movie genre. Things were quiet. Deadpool, which cost $40 million to make, was this passion project between Ryan Reynolds and Tim Miller, put out by Fox in February on Valentine's Day. People were really nervous about it back then. I didn't think it was going to do very well at all. I thought it was going to open at like $45 million. But the marketing and the tone is so different than the rest of the comic movie genre that it just crushes. I think it opened at what 130 something. It closes out at 376. A February movie making 376. That really changed the ball game, because it proved that an origin film from a character that wasn't like super popular could really hit a grand slam if the tone was right and the marketing was right. And it was a little bit of a parody of comic book movies, and it was definitely as much a comedy as it was an action movie. It felt even like more of a comedy than an action movie. So a very different tone, and it marked a shift in the comic book movie genre. So that's why I call it the fourth wave. Then you have Batman vs. Superman, disaster. 342 does not sound like a disaster, but for a movie with those two characters, anything below $500 million doesn't make any sense. Captain America Civil War does 423. X-Men starts to really fall apart in 2016, does 161. Suicide Squad does really well, 337. Doctor Strange does 241. Logan does 226. Logan, to me, kind of matches Deadpool. And I talked about this before. Whereas Deadpool was a part of that comic. These are sort of different paths the comic book genre is taking creatively. Deadpool was like the irony parody route. Let's make fun of the comic book movie genre, tell a lot of jokes, be self-referential, break the fourth wall a lot. Logan is like a different path into almost adult drama, and almost was like an existential drama aspect to Logan. It was so much darker and honestly, I'm more emotionally rich than any other comic book movie that I've ever seen over the last 20, 30 years. And so there's like a different path the genre is taking in this fourth wave. Guardians of the Galaxies 2, obviously last year, does really well, 389. Wonder Woman comes out of nowhere last year and does, opens a little bit lower than suggested, low 100s, I believe, closes out at 412. I mean, just an amazing run for that film. Fantastic multiplier. Women went to go see that movie over and over again. Definitely feels like a strong point of this fourth wave. Thor Ragnarok, Justice League. Ragnarok was a huge hit. Justice League was a massive flop. Justice League was supposed to be like the Avengers. Justice League was supposed to make $600 million domestically at the box office. It makes $229. That's how big of a flop it was. There's no way you can see that any other way. And then, of course, we hit Black Panther. I know I said 10 minutes, probably like 15 minutes. That's the comic book movie renaissance over the last 15 years. Started with X-Men, has now gone all the way through Black Panther. Black Panther, to me, even more so than Avengers Infinity War, to me is the fifth wave. This is the fifth wave. We're in a new wave of comic book movies. I don't know what's going to happen. Nobody knows what's going to happen with the genre. Infinity War is definitely this turning point. Where is this genre going to go? Is it continue to go up? Before Black Panther came out, I thought Avengers in 2012 was going to be the peak of the genre. I really did. I just didn't feel like the comic book movie genre was ever going to reach that height again. It felt like the Avengers was the culmination of a good 10 years of comic book movies getting bigger and better, and then they just hit this massive grand slam in May of 2012 and make $702 million domestically. I forget what it did worldwide. But instead of fading, comic movies just sort of reinvented themselves over and over again, especially with Deadpool and Logan over the last couple of years. And then when Black Panther hit, my entire theory was blown out the window. I thought things were going to quiet down after the Avengers, but they've only gotten more. It's not necessarily that movies have reached the same height as the Avengers, but a lot of these movies are making $300-400 million without blinking an eye. And that's just like, it's insane to me. And then when Black Panther comes along, you sort of have to like rethink about the whole genre. Like, who would have guessed that Black Panther, an origin film from, a somewhat well-known character, but not massively well-known character, it's still going at 682, probably won't make 700 million, but probably 690, mid 690s, within touching distance with the Avengers. It has to be the start of something new in the genre. And I think Avengers Infinity War, people are saying it feels like a finale, but I think it's the beginning of something new. I think it's the beginning of a different path for the genre, where it's maybe we don't see them as, and I always fought this theory for like the last decade. I was like, no, comic book movies aren't going to be like this. They're going to eventually fade. But maybe comic book movies are kind of like the new Western, where it's just this genre of film that's always going to be around, at least for the foreseeable future. And there'll be a lot of sort of subgenres in it and a lot of creativity within the genre. But that sort of type of movie is always going to be, in the top 5 of the box office. It kind of feels that way now. Now, the only thing that would sort of make me think twice about that is if Avengers Infinity War, opens below 200 or something like that, and the multiplier is super low, because then that would suggest that like it's not playing well with casual moviegoers. I don't see that happening. I think it's going to do I think it's going to open at 225. Multiplier for Avengers Infinity War, I don't know. I think it's going to do at least, let's say it opens at 225, at least 2.5. I think it probably makes $575 to $600 million, probably in that range. So another huge, massive hit for the comic book movie genre. And so, it's interesting. I feel like Avengers Infinity War is being seen as a finale, but I do think if you tie it together with Black Panther, it's going to be the start of something new. I think it's going to be MCU Part 2, and I think people are going to stick around and see these movies. I don't think they're going anywhere. I think comic book movies have just become an integral part of our culture, for better or for worse. And I just don't see them going anywhere. And I hope that there's a lot more experimentation in the genre, like Logan and Deadpool, because that just makes it a more rich experience for people, to give them different options and different stories and different characters to engage with and connect with. Wonder Woman's another example. The first real big women focused comic book movie, and it's just amazing to see. And it's such an awesome genre and movement to follow. Artistically, it has some down points, every so often. But there's also some massive high points artistically. And I point to something like Logan. Logan was one of the best movies I saw last year. Even if I throw in all the art films that I saw, which I really love, Logan was up there with those as some of the best art that I saw. And so, we'll see what Avengers Infinity War does. I'll do the show on Sunday, and we'll do a little review of what happens, and we'll maybe plan out and see where that film's going to go and what that means for the genre. But I'm excited to see what happens. Really excited. So I hope you join me on Sunday for the review show. Thanks for listening, guys. This has been the Wildline Podcast.